Last week from Charlie Winter. He's a senior research fellow at King's College in London. He's been keeping an eye on ISIS media operations for quite a while now, and he noticed something a little odd about the month of April. He said just under 20% of its audiovisual output focused on civilian life, and that's the largest proportion of utopia propaganda since 2016. So I wanted to ask Charlie a few questions about how ISIS sees their place in the war and the broader conflict in the Middle East. So, Charlie Winter, you say utopia is back with ISIS and their messaging. Break that down a little bit for us. What's new in how ISIS is trying to control the narrative here? The last I saw, they're down to less than 2% of the territory they once held. So these are pretty interesting times for the group.
Yeah, definitely. What we're seeing now, this recent uptick, and when I say uptick, I mean the proportion of utopia-related propaganda that there is today is higher than it's been since 2015. So this is significant, even if it's not something which is sustained. It was probably at its lowest towards the end of last year. So this is in the aftermath of the fall of Mosul, in the aftermath of the fall of Raqqa, but also, importantly, the fall of places like Mayadin, Al-Kamal, and a string of other territories in eastern Syria that the Islamic State had long been focusing on the governance of. It needs to be governing places in order to make propaganda about governing places. So when it lost all that, it was less capable, less able to do that. But it's not necessarily indicative of the fact that the Islamic State has controlled more territories in the last month or so. It's not necessarily indicative of it expanding or its capabilities expanding. It could well just be indicative of the fact that the group is trying to show that it is still a governing actor in wherever it is, whether it's Afghanistan or Egypt or wherever.
In your own words, what's important about narratives in this ISIS war?
Well, I think that the narrative space is the decisive battle space currently in the war against the Islamic State. So, yes, materially, the group has suffered a huge amount of losses in the last couple of years, actually. Materially, it is much weaker than it has been for a very long time. But that doesn't necessarily matter in terms of the threat, the security threat that it presents, both inside places like Syria and Iraq and outside of its core territories in places like the US or Europe or Southeast Asia. What matters there is the perception of the group. And kind of intrinsically bound to that is this idea of narrative, this idea of the Islamic State brand. Where does that stand today in light of the kind of consecutive defeats that it's faced in Syria and Iraq? And with this kind of consistent, persistent infatuation with strategic communication that the Islamic State is still exhibiting to this day, I think it is still very, very important that we think about the narrative space as an area that needs to be engaged with, even if that engagement isn't necessarily direct, even if it's more shaping the narrative space rather than directly having a hand in it.
Well, what then would that look like?
Well, I mean, I guess what I'm circling here is whether it is appropriate to try to launch a load of counter-narratives or alternative narratives or whatever, perhaps because it makes so much propaganda or has made so much propaganda, and because that propaganda has been very shiny, very seemingly effective, very high quality, it has been intuitive that in order to respond to the Islamic State, we need to respond in kind by making our own flashy videos, our own accounts of what this organization is all about.
Yeah, you remind me of what has been called the bullshit asymmetry principle. The amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude greater than to create it.
In order to kind of meaningfully engage in this kind of war of narratives, it may require thinking a little bit more laterally. So not necessarily thinking in terms of, we'll make this video here, we'll make this video here, we'll kind of tactically engage with it here. Rather, I think there needs to be more strategic thinking about what policy looks like in the long run, or what military operations, what intervention looks like in the long run, and the kind of real on-ground impact of those things. And then, again, how that will be eventually incorporated into the narrative space. So essentially thinking a little bit more in abstract terms than just thinking, they make lots of propaganda, let's make lots of propaganda and throw it all back at them. Because that has been proven to be, well, really quite ineffective in certain contexts over the last few years.
So the story of Dabiq was the story of kind of like an end times scenario where ISIS, if I'm not mistaken, was telling the world, their supporters in particular, that the end of the world would come with this battle in Dabiq, and if also northwestern Syria. How did that play out among their followers and in the whole narrative space? Because Dabiq, their presence there is gone, and of course we are all still appear to be living just fine.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is one of the great quirks of Islamic State media operations. Basically, it's pretty simple. What it did the minute that it lost control of the place, it began to think about how it could rearrange the world to fit its needs there. So rather than saying, "Oh no, we've lost Dabiq," and that clearly shows that actually this whole apocalypse thing that we thought was just around the corner, that's not going to happen. Instead of doing that, they said, "Oh no, of course we lost Dabiq. That was always going to happen. Losing Dabiq was part of God's plan for us as Muslims, as an Islamic State. It was him helping purify our ranks, and actually, if anything, us losing it is a sign that he is continuing to favor us as a movement." So, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous acrobatics and messing around with reality and history and also theology as well. But the Islamic State has been doing this for many, many years. I mean, I was reading a statement made by Abu Musa al-Zarqawi, the guy that is essentially the godfather of the Islamic State today, leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, who was killed in 2006. This statement is something where he talks at length about Fallujah and what the loss of the battle for Fallujah meant to him. So this is back in early 2000s. And essentially he took the same approach. He said, yeah, sure, we may have lost Fallujah to the Americans, but hell, it doesn't matter, because look at all this other good stuff that we managed to do in the meantime. And aside from all of that other good stuff, of course we lost Fallujah because God willed that we would lose Fallujah. And this is all part of his plan. This is all confirmation again and again and again that we are on the right path. So essentially, if you're preaching to the converted, if you're preaching to true believers in a movement, it's quite easy to preach, well, as you're saying earlier, bullshit.
Right. Well, so if past is any indication, what's your forecast on what lies ahead?
Well, obviously we just had a week of perhaps more attacks internationally than there had been for a little while. So there's been a few, 3 in Indonesia yesterday, another one just claimed by the Outmark News Agency today, then Jalalabad, I think another one in Kabul. This is off the top of my head, so I'm sure I'm missing attacks out. And then, of course, France. And this is on top of the kind of daily grind of attacks in Libya, Iraq, and Syria, and elsewhere that are continuing to happen. So the Islamic State is still very much there. It's still very much a security threat as well. In terms of its ability to actually perpetrate and incite acts of terrorism in its name, then I think we need to look very, very carefully at the next few weeks. Of course, we're entering into Ramadan pretty soon, and Ramadan has been historically a time of greater levels of violence by supporters of the Islamic State. And I think violence, to an extent, begets violence. So we need to look very, very carefully at what happens in the next few weeks in order to forecast what might be happening in the next few months.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't even realize that Ramadan starts this week. So thanks for at least bringing that to my attention. I know if I was still in Afghanistan, I would have known that already. Charlie Winter, thanks for talking to us on Defense One Radio.
No problem. Good to chat. Thanks for having me on. Cheers.